Strategic Affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome. Good morning from India. It's a Saturday morning and it's just a day after, or maybe just 12 hours after a summit between the US President Joe Biden and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, followed by an first in-person summit of the Quad leaders, Japan, India, Australia and the United States, both taking place in the US. And of course, several takeaways from there. But before we get into a discussion with our guest, Ambassador Arun K. Singh, India's former ambassador to France as well as the United States, some takeaways, some points from these two summits that have taken place. The Modi-Biden summit was, of course, the first in-person summit between the two leaders. And if you look at some of the key points takeaways from there, it's about the new phase in relationship that both talked about. Modi, of course, says the transformative decade lies ahead of us. And Biden sees this as a new chapter in Indo-U.S. relationship. There is, of course, the other points about what they could do together in terms of trade, in terms of even technology. But there was no reference to what could be a hot button issue, Afghanistan or Pakistan, between the two leaders. At least there was no reference to it. COVID and climate change remain the biggest challenge. And trade, of course, is the most important aspect. It was identified, at least by the Indian side, publicly, that it is going to be the most important aspect. So, before I get into the Quad Summit, let me ask my guest, Ambassador Arun Singh, about his views on what the takeaways are and what does he think is the outcome of the Biden-Modi summit. Ambassador Arun Singh?
This is the first time that they met in person after Joe Biden became the president. So that's important in itself. They spoke on the phone a couple of times, and Joe Biden hosted the virtual Quad Summit in March. And they were also together virtually at some multilateral events. But this is the first in-person meeting. And I think it would be important for both leaders to hear from each other their perspectives on major issues. And I think for our Prime Minister, it would be useful to understand how does Joe Biden himself look at the bilateral relationship? How does he want to advance it? Because ultimately, as they say, the buck stops with him and he takes the final decision. I think this was also an opportunity for the Indian Prime Minister to understand from him on Afghanistan that after the US withdrawal and the fact that the Taliban government continues to have links with terrorist elements, US intelligence community has said that, UN reports have said that, and not only links, but many designated terrorists are an integral part of this government at very, very critical levels. So to understand how does the US intend to deal with this going ahead, because that certainly has implication for India's security. And related to that would be the dimension about the enablers of this, that there are governments that are enabling the Taliban to do the kind of policy it is resorting to, supporting them, training, equipping, funding the kind of violence they have indulged in. What would be the strategy to deal with them? So I think this would be one sort of takeaways. The other thing I'm sure the Prime Minister would want to understand directly from the US President about what is his vision for the Indo-Pacific, for the China relationship. Because at one level, Joe Biden, like Donald Trump earlier, has come out very strongly that there needs to be a pushback on the unilateral actions from China and the kind of policy China has indulged in South China Sea, East China Sea, along the line of control with India, and its unilateral assertion. But the present administration has taken several steps to ease on what the Trump administration has done. You saw recently they've just released the chief financial officer of Huawei, who's now gone back. The sanctions on some of the Chinese researchers in the US, they've gone back on that. Some of the restrictions on Chinese Confucius institutes in the US, they've gone back on that. And Joe Biden had a conversation with President Xi, where he said that we will compete intensely where we disagree, but not take it to the point of conflict. So I think again important to understand what is the vision for this. And then going beyond that, the bilateral relationship, there is so much going on. Defense cooperation has become very strong. Starting from zero in 2008, we have now contracted to buy almost $20 billion of defense equipment. We are looking at technology partnerships, and in fact, in the fact sheet put out by the US State Department, they have specifically referred to the recent agreement to work together for air-launched unmanned aerial vehicles and how there would be a technology partnership related to that. We are doing more and more complex exercises with each other. There is sharing of information, sharing of intelligence, and according to things that had come out in the public domain, when we had the challenges along the line of actual control with China last year, there was certain supplies that had been made available by the US, and also sharing of very relevant information and intelligence. So, and the two sort of armed forces, navies, and others are doing more and more exercises leading to interoperability. So the bilateral relationship is also advancing, and I think there is a sense, and the Prime Minister referred to that, of technology being an important element in the partnership. Because going ahead, new and emerging technologies are going to completely transform the way we live, the way we work. And therefore, to give a more solid foundation to the growing strategic and political convergence, it would be also important to enhance the technology dimension of the partnership. And there, the talent that India brings to the table. And if the US is looking at competition from China, it will need a partnership with India in technology, given the number. And then the US recognizes that there are comparative advantages in Indian skilled persons. For example, many leading US companies have said that the largest pool of cybersecurity talent in the world is in India. And many US companies, although they own the intellectual property, do cutting edge design work in India. So there is that level of partnership.
Absolutely. What about some downside? Because trade continues to be a wrinkle. The kind of convergence on trade seems to elude both sides. Do you see any breakthrough coming up there, or at least some effort to take it to the next level?
So you're right. It continues to be a downside, and efforts have been made for some time to even work out a limited trade deal, and that has also not worked. And I remember way back in September 2019, when Prime Minister Modi had a meeting with President Trump in New York. It was said that a mini trade deal is about to be finalized, and now we are
Exactly.
in 2021, and nothing has happened. And from various reports that come out, it seems that there are existing interests on both sides. Certain areas where the US wants concession, we have interest in India, there's production in India, which is opposed to that. Similarly, in many cases where India offered concessions, then one US company was willing to go ahead, some other US company was not willing to accept that. So there are complications on both sides. And I feel a better way forward would be not just to look at trade based on current patterns of production, but to create new opportunities for collaboration. And therefore, this talk of technology, through this technology partnership, build new avenues for cooperation between industry in India, industry in the US, innovation, so that there are new frameworks of interaction. And as we build sort of from scratch, then there will be new opportunities for trade and interaction. I think that may be a more productive way to go ahead. And we have a long way to go. Our trade is $150 billion. It has increased 7 times in the last 20 years. But it is way below the US-China trade, which is more than $550 billion. So there's a long way to go.
Exactly. So there's this other feeling that a lot of commentators have had after Prime Minister Modi and Vice President Kamala Harris's meeting, that she was holding firm on her beliefs about how India is performing as a democracy or not performing as a democracy, and she sort of had a snub for the Prime Minister. How do you see that narrative really?
So I didn't quite see her comments in that light, and I think it was a very carefully crafted statement so that different people would take away what they wanted. Because she didn't refer to democracy in India in any negative
Yes.
sense. She spoke about democracies everywhere needing to
Yes.
strengthen themselves. And therefore, there was an acknowledgement that US faces its own challenges. And you know, for example, that the US and their leaders have said has faced the challenge of systemic racism. We have seen the challenge related to voter suppression, violence against
Yes.
minorities. And even
Right.
today, there is related to denial of election outcomes, redistricting of districts. So there are issues related to human rights that the US is struggling with. And again, with the manner in which US has withdrawn from Afghanistan, and the impact on human rights dimension there, including rights of women, rights of minorities. The US has its own challenges, but I
Exactly.
think US is also positioning itself globally that in this current competition with China, they will want to do advocacy also based on human rights and
Exactly.
therefore make that as an important platform. So
Right.
I saw that as a generic sort of assertion of US position so that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party would be happy that that comment has been made. Those who are critical of the Indian government would say that there is criticism of the Indian government, and others would say that, look, there is no real criticism. It's an acknowledgement of the fact that all societies face challenges and you need to have conversation and move forward. And you'd have seen that the Prime Minister in his own comments, both along with Kamala Harris and later at the Quad meeting, spoke about the importance of democracy and moving forward on that basis.
Oh, he did. In fact, I think the US position is also being a little consistent. It's evolving consistently. Secretary Blinken, while in India, also spoke on the same lines as what Kamala Harris said in DC last week or just 2 days ago. So moving on, let's look at the Quad in-person first in-person summit and some takeaways there. And before I come to you for your comments, let's take a look at what exactly the Quad leaders discussed. So the common narrative, of course, was to ensure free and open Indo-Pacific, uh, the region. Leaders, of course, look like they're reading from the same book, but not on the same page on many issues. And I think Prime Minister Modi has made it very clear that Quad can bring in collective good in terms of vaccines, in terms of resilient supply chains. So I think India's stand is very clear, and I think India has made it clear a number of times that it is not a military alliance or there's no military dimension to it. So therefore, I think this was very clear to me as far as the Quad summit was concerned. It was about COVID, about technology, about infrastructure, about resilient supply chains, and maybe even climate change going forward. But I think all of us, all the countries have different approaches to this. But why I sort of want your comment on what happened in Quad first, and then later the AUKUS, which has come as a kind of intangible suddenly in the last 1 week or so. So, how do you see Quad operating with AUKUS? Does it free India from the responsibility in the Indo-Pacific against China? How do you see that?
And I think India's position has been consistent since India became independent, that it is not going to be part of any military alliance structure. That having been said, the Quad certainly looks at security issues. After all, it has been called the quadrilateral security dialogue. And so there are issues, and I think some of when you talk of a rules-based international order, which the Quad talks about, you are talking about security issues. And it can be argued with credibility that COVID-19, climate change, Indo-Pacific all have security dimensions. So, not being a military alliance, but security aspects are certainly being looked at. I think the Quad, the effort of the members is one to show that the members are benefiting from being a part of the Quad and getting better access to technology, talking about supply chain resilience initiative. And in the context of this summit, for example, this talk about 100 students every year being taken from the different countries for studying in the US. That's important. And that the Quad countries getting into cooperation in space. And talking about producing secure, critical technologies that are essential for digital economies globally. And
Right.
again, 5G deployment and diversification. So the many areas that they have identified where the members benefit from being part of the Quad. So that's an important message. And the second message is that Other countries in the region also benefit from cooperation in the Quad framework. Because there are some suspicions related to Quad, especially China and Russia have tried to amplify those suspicions because they see some challenges to their own interests and role from this. ASEAN countries are worried whether it will take away from this talk of ASEAN centrality. So there is an effort to show that the Quad framework of cooperation benefits others, and therefore this important decision on vaccines, that by end of next year, 1 billion vaccines would be made available to countries in the region. Technology from the US, funding from US and Japan, produced in India, and logistics also supported by Australia. So that's the message. And then there will be partnership in climate action, partnership in new and emerging technologies. Now, in this framework, looking at AUKUS, the question that you raised, AUKUS is clearly a very narrow military alliance, and it has been projected as such. And as I see it, that's a decision that US, UK, and Australia took based on their own interests. You know, Australia needed some messaging related to the pressure they are under from China on trade and other issues. UK needed some messaging to show that, you know, although they have withdrawn from Europe, although there is Brexit, they are now global Britain and they have a role to play. The US needed some messaging at this stage that although they have withdrawn from Afghanistan and everybody is talking about US power being in retreat, despite that, they will be robust in other international interests where their engagement is important from their perspective. Hence, it served the interest of all these three countries. Now, again, even in the past, all countries and all participants in Quad also have spoken about not one architecture of security for the region, but networks of architectures for security in the region where different countries do groupings based on their interests. India has an arrangement where it talks about India, France, Australia. There's an India, Japan, Australia arrangement. US also has a US, Japan, South Korea arrangement. And aside from this region, you know, India is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Exactly.
India is part of Russia, India, China foreign ministers meeting, part of BRICS.
Yes.
And therefore, as I see it, the AUKUS does not in any way detract from what Quad brings in the framework of cooperation, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but beyond, because, you know, Indian leaders have articulated repeatedly that they see Quad as a partnership focused in the global context, not just the regional context.
Right. And not in the Indian Western Indian Ocean also. But you've been ambassador to France. France's reaction, was it over the top? Was it expected, or was it now? Is it being tempered now with the events that have unfolded after the announcement of AUKUS and now I think discussion between Macron and Biden? How is it going?
So I think at one level the French reaction was certainly justified because they have an election coming, and the president needed to save his position against criticism. That having been said, the French see themselves as an important player in the Indo-Pacific region because they have a physical presence. They have a physical presence in Reunion Islands. They have a physical presence in New Caledonia in the Pacific. So they have a physical presence in this region. There are French nationals living on islands in this region, and there's a French naval presence. So they see themselves as playing an important role. And so they would have felt that this alliance, and blindsiding them, not even discussing issues, didn't take into account their relevance and role in this region. I think they were also piqued because there is a commercial angle involved. They were to supply diesel submarines to Australia. Now
Submarines.
that process ends. So that certainly has an impact. And I don't rule out the fact that they were, in addition, piqued that it involves the British. Because there is a French-British rivalry. And I saw that when I was ambassador in France. Now, there's a tremendous French-British rivalry in the European context. And the French would have felt that even in the Indo-Pacific, where they have a far stronger presence than the British, they have been outmaneuvered by the British into an alliance and they have been left out. So I think all these factors come into play. But over time, they will get over it because for France, partnerships in the region are important. For France, the relationship with the US is important. And they've had similar challenges in the past. In 2003, France opposed US action in Iraq. And the US reaction was very, very negative. You may remember the then US Defense Secretary said that
Exactly.
in military messes, we will not call it French fries anymore. We will call it independence fries.
Exactly. The French, I think, like you rightly said, have been feeling outmaneuvered. But it benefits India in many ways, I guess, that the French would like India to be their, sort of stronger strategic partner, I guess. Would you agree to that?
Certainly, I mean, India must seize every opportunity, and I think you would have seen that soon after this, the French president and the Indian Prime Minister had a conversation where there was, mention was made that we will consolidate further our partnership in the Indo-Pacific. And after that, the French president put out a tweet, which was an exceptionally warm tweet about the
Right.
conversation with some words also in Hindi. I think, look, the French relationship is important for India. More
Yes.
and more with the strategic convergence that is happening, India is developing a relationship with the US, other countries in Europe, and with France in strategic areas of interest: nuclear energy, space, defense. Our strongest partner in Europe is France. Now, while
Absolutely.
being part of the Western alliance system, France wants to maintain the strategic autonomy of its decision making. Therefore, as we build our relations with countries in Europe and the US, it is important for us to have a partner which may not always think the same way as the US, so that when we take a different position, we can find support elsewhere. And when we had done the nuclear tests in 1998, US had criticized India and done sanctions against India. Russia had criticized India very strongly but opposed
Right.
sanctions against India. The French
Yeah.
did not criticize India and opposed sanctions in India. And
Exactly.
they were very helpful also in August 2019 when the Chinese tried to move the UN Security Council against India when we had taken action in Jammu and Kashmir. And the French were very helpful.
Exactly. No, so I think they're very reliably stable partner as far as India is concerned. One final question, Ambassador Arun Singh. The UK role in the Indo-Pacific. It's a new breakout by the United Kingdom coming this side. Should India worry? Because when they left India at the partition of India in 1947, they continued to play a role in AFPAC and continue to maneuver in that area. And now they're coming into the Indo-Pacific. May not be such a good idea as what many people think as far as India is concerned. What's your view on that?
So I think one of the reason the UK wants to project a role in the Indo-Pacific is what we discussed earlier. That as the UK has done Brexit, come out of the European Union, they want to project domestically that they have other options, that they are now global Britain. They have a wider role to justify to their own domestic audience, another important reason for doing Brexit. So they wanted to be active in the Indo-Pacific. The second thing is for the British, the US relationship is very important. With the British having declined in relative international power and influence, the only way they are able to enhance their influence is by being in lockstep with the US, doing what the US wants and trying to project to the US that we are useful to you. So they are playing a role in the Indo-Pacific again as a message to the US that look, you are going to shift focus to the Indo-Pacific. And so the British are worried that if the US shifts focus away from Europe to the Indo-Pacific, the US may not give the same importance to Britain. So they're saying, we will be there in the Indo-Pacific, we will work with you, we will be helpful to you to remain relevant to the US. I think
Right.
the third thing they're trying to do is they recognize that in India there's tremendous sort of negative orientation to the UK because of the negative role they played in the context of Pakistan and Afghanistan and the whole ARPAC equation. And I
Exactly.
think there they are stuck a bit because for their own counterterrorism concerns, they need cooperation from Pakistan. So they are trying to project that while that is going on, in the maritime domain, they can do more cooperation with India to find a way of cooperating with India. So I think with all this, I don't believe that there's any reason for concern. And given our own strength and where the
Right.
UK is now, that is
Right.
not a challenge that we should really worry about.
I think we have outstripped them in all parameters, most of the parameters, but that's for the future for us to look at how it pans out. certainly the world is in a flux, as you would agree, Ambassador. But thank you very much for your insights and very incisive comments on what's happening. We'll come back to you whenever we have these opportunities. But for the moment, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Nitin.
And viewers, don't forget to keep sending feedback to us. And of course, you know where to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You know our social media handles. Keep following them. Keep sending comments. And of course, we'll bring to you as many insightful discussions as possible. But for the moment, it's goodbye.